Hi everyone, welcome to the fifth episode of the Women Startup Leader Series. In this episode, we have Nitida Wongthipkongka as speaker and Nisha Rahman, CEO of Bangladesh Angels, as moderator.
So Nitida Wongthipkongka is passionate about social impact and improving the quality of lives around the world. She is currently a venture director at Rippleworks, a foundation focused on helping high-impact ventures scale. She works with CEOs, investors, and other partners to help ventures tackle their current challenges to enable them to expand their impact and scale. Prior to Rippleworks, Nitida developed and supported social ventures with SC Johnson, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, WSUP, and with other nonprofit organizations in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She also has deep private sector experience through her roles at Boston Consulting Group, Novartis, Kraft Foods, and ExxonMobil. Nitida, welcome to Bangladesh Angels.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And so for those who are not familiar, for better and for worse, Nitida is one of three people who are responsible for unleashing me on Bangladesh, because back in 2014, I was looking to come back and do work there, and they needed somebody. Back then, she was with Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, trying to develop social ventures in sanitation. They needed someone, I guess, of my complexion to get back to Bangladesh and see what can be done. And so, Nitida, I guess you have Nitida to thank or to blame, depending on what your experience has been on the various ventures I've worked on. But thank you, Nitida, I guess, for giving me that bridge back to Bangladesh.
You did not give yourself credit. The reason why we asked you to join us was for your passion for Bangladesh, and to try to make an impact in Bangladesh specifically. So I think it was your passion, not so much your complexion. It's the reason why we asked you to join
us. Awesome. But no, thank you. So we always like to kind of start at the top, right? To kind of get to know somebody. And so for the benefit of those who are, who don't know you as well as I do, what are your origins? Where did you grow up, and how, where did you grow up, and what did you aspire to be when you were younger?
Yeah, so I was really, blessed. I was born and raised in the U.S., but my parents were actually immigrants from Thailand. So my background grew up in a city school in Chicago, sort of like straddled the two worlds. I either went on vacation in Thailand or I just stayed in my house in Chicago. So I think this might be familiar to some people. And I sort of always had these two worlds about me, and I was very fortunate that my parents, gave me the opportunity to get my university degree at University of Illinois, where I got my chemical engineering degree, and started my career, followed sort of all the traditional paths of finding a good corporate job and moving up the ladder. But at some point in my late 20s, I started to think about there's got to be more. Like it felt like I enjoyed my life, but it felt like I could be giving back more to the world and I could have a broader view. So that's actually when I moved to China to go teach English for a year just to get different perspective. And I sort of knew I wanted to go back to get my graduate degree, which I was then fortunate enough to be able to go to MIT Sloan to do a dual degree, both in engineering as well as my MBA. But yeah, this part just nagged me that, there was so much in the world happening, and I wanted to give back. I didn't quite know how, and everyone sort of advised, like health was a great way. In 2008, at that point, global health is really starting to take off. So that's how I ended up at Novartis. You gave me the international perspective in health. But I think as many of us have seen sort of in the past 10 years is I think we all want to do more. So this is how I ended up finding the world of social enterprise and social business, sort of the intersection of impact and market principles. And I sort of have been building my career there since, sort of going back and forth between the impact sector as well as the corporate sector. But that's sort of a bit of my background. I think there was always an inkling that I saw the development in Thailand, and it really was inspiring to me, but I also realized some of the pitfalls that had happened there. So I really wanted to lend my voice and my brain as well as my physical energy to go and help figure out how could we improve the lives of others while really maintaining their and respecting the cultures that are in each country.
Sorry, you took a lot of your kind of supply chain and business development expertise, and then one of the places you end up being was with WSUP, which we worked together on, and it was sort of the Skunk Works team called WSUP Enterprises at the time. So once again, for those who might not be familiar, what is WSUP first and foremost, and second, what was the original intent and vision behind WSUP Enterprises?
Yeah, so WSUP is actually a nonprofit based in the UK. They're really focused on developing what we call service providers for water and sanitation in emerging markets, specifically around urban centers. And their thesis was that, there's these service providers who are really providing valuable services like we all take for granted, which is clean drinking water as well as, working toilets. And they just weren't really great. They weren't based in market principles. So they were trying to develop like them as service providers to work with the government. But at the same time, I think probably somewhere between 2005 and 2010, this field of social enterprise, which is you could run a business that has a dual bottom line, right? It can create impact as well as make money at the same time, was starting to emerge. And our manager, Andy Narracott, sort of was really passionate about this, and he sort of spearheaded an experiment in some ways within WSUP that we could start up sanitation business to do the same. So we were really lucky that we had funders who were really supportive, and our idea was we were going to try to figure out where the market failures were within these countries and build up businesses. And I think one of the key factors was we are not talking about helping the poorest of the poor who barely have enough to eat, but this is sort of the next like ladder up, which is, these are families who are starting to have a little bit of disposable income, and they obviously like want to improve their lives as we all do, and that they would be willing to pay for services that improve their lives. And so we were building businesses that met their core needs, not so much of like you need to have water and sanitation, but like it improved their life, the quality of life, and they were willing to pay for these services that would help make these businesses profitable. And the thesis was the startup capital would be quite large for it because obviously it takes a lot to build any infrastructure business, but that over time by volume, we would be able to provide a service that we could make money at the same time. But yeah, so that's what we were doing. We were starting up 4 different types of water and sanitation businesses in Ghana, Kenya, Bangladesh, and Zambia. And our model that we had where we were sending out country leads similar to Niger to first understand what the market dynamics were and what the market need was, and sort of the intricacies of each country, and then to develop a business model and to test that to be able to grow it.
So that's quite interesting, right? And so if you were to quantify, and I'm sure I've seen this in one of the proposals we must have done together, but if you were to quantify it, does that mean people not making less, is this like $3 to $5 a day? Is it less than $2? What is that defined by when you say, this sort of, I guess, not the extreme poor, but the, I guess, increasingly affluent BOP?
Yeah, I think so. I think I have a hard time when it's like under $2 a day, right? Because it's so hard depending on where you are and what the cost of living is. I think it's more of like the emerging low income moving toward the middle income in each country. And I think as we all know, like that's usually much lower than most people realize. But this is where families likely have enough to eat. They have somewhat steady income month to month and a little bit of disposable income, right? Like they may not have large amounts of savings, but they're starting to be able to have enough savings to decide between like education and health and like being able to invest in the livelihoods and like the well-being of their families. And so, obviously with this demographic, they are able to pay, but it's also, they have so many constraints on their time as well and their resources. So they are very value driven. And because they know what it means to not have means, they are very shrewd, and you have to really demonstrate your value proposition for them to continue engaging with you.
Got it. And so out of that came kind of 2 ventures, right? And one's kind of still going, another has shut down. And so one was Clean Team, and then the second one was Smart Life. And so Clean Team was in Ghana, Smart Life was in Kenya, and then we tried a version of Clean Team in Bangladesh. Once again, for the benefit of those in the room, could you explain to us what those businesses were, what they were trying to achieve?
Yeah, so Clean Team was a sanitation business. Ghana at the time was predominantly public toilets. So most people didn't have toilets in their house. And obviously this made quite a lot of issues in terms of either physical safety or hygiene, because people were just getting sick because they were going to these public toilets that were not very clean. So what Clean Team did was we offered household portable toilets where, you would be able to rent, or like you'd be able to lease our toilet for month on month, and you'd pay for the service for us to collect your waste. And our intention was to also collect that waste and hopefully be able to turn it into energy. But the first and foremost, we wanted to provide access to sanitation in your house, and we would provide the service to collect that waste and remove it. Smart Life, on the other hand, was based in Kenya. This is based around clean drinking water and health and wellness products. So the business design was that we would provide you clean drinking water. And actually, this is sort of funny. I was actually a customer as well because the water tasted so nice and clean. I actually was a purchaser as well. But that was basically at cost or almost the loss leader. And in addition, because it's a subscription model, we would then be able to have access to customers to advertise fortified foods and other health and wellness products like electrolytes for children, as well as fortified like maize that was often used just to help with the nutrition levels of the demographics we were working with. So the thought was that as a subscription model, you would first come in to buy water and we would deliver it to your house, and then we would become a full service wellness product where they could buy these other products as well and have it delivered.
Excellent. And then it wasn't just WSUP that was involved, right? There were other stakeholders like IDEO in this case, or Unilever. So what were their roles in trying to create these businesses?
Yeah, I think IDEO, when we brought that, so this is really a partnership between WSUP and Unilever with both of these businesses. In the case of Smart Life, we also brought in Gain, which is a European-based nonprofit based on nutrition as well, as a partner. In both of the cases, we had asked IDEO.org as really big leaders in design thinking to do the initial user research and help us build a business model. And so the output of that work was a business concept as well as a brand of like, what are the core needs that we were trying to meet, and sort of a rough idea of how we would be able to implement it. And then WSUP was the implementing partner, and Unilever was sort of a thought partner. Like they would help us with resources, but on the ground operating, it was WSUP who was tasked to do that. But our board essentially had Unilever as well as Gain for Smart Life.
So on the surface, I mean, it sounds quite revolutionary, right? As NGOs getting into the game of creating social enterprises, working with corporates, hand in hand in corporates, as well as, I guess, with local leaders to try to get these off the ground. That's also a question, I think a lot of NGOs in Bangladesh are grappling with, okay, how do we, especially now that the country is moving up the ladder, there's less and less funds for kind of direct aid, how do we go into private sector development? What were some assumptions, I guess, behind both of those businesses that ultimately when you launched, maybe at least for you, like, all right, maybe it didn't quite stick, or maybe you think, didn't quite work out?
Yeah, so I think now looking back, I would also just point out that in both of the cases of WSUP and Unilever, it wasn't part of the core business, right? This is sort of like an innovation arm that was running them. So I think you'll find that I think a nonprofit or NGO who tries to do it on their own, like from the core team, has a really difficult time when you have these established processes and you can't be agile. And I think throughout my career, I have found that often does work better because you're able to sort of break things faster and not get stuck in the decision making. So that was a benefit to both of these businesses. I think with Smart Life, one of the things that Smart Life is the business that we ultimately decided to close, because we were doing really well on the water business. But once again, as I was saying, the business model was always the thought that it was either at break even or a slight loss. And there was an assumption that there were these health products that were available that the market wanted. And what we found actually when I was sort of doing an audit with our management team was that the availability of those products was actually more sparse than we had originally thought about. And we hadn't thoroughly tested the ones that would work well with our customers. So we were finding that we were scaling a loss, right? Like we were selling more water, which is great, but ultimately, if you continue to scale, you were scaling losses. You were like signing up to, unless you could figure out a profitability model that worked with the health products, it didn't make sense that way. And we were finding either limited supply of these health products, or two, not great pricing to be able to offer to our consumers at a price point that they would buy it. And then we also had the third thing that is always really difficult before you even know is the cost of running business, right? Kenya at the time was going through some pretty big changes of devolution from the national government to the regional governments. And we were getting stuck in the middle of that. Like, they made the mandate, but there were no, not surprisingly, there were no processes to actually implement it. And so it became a little bit of a, do we feel that we had enough traction to be able to continue finding these products in a really sticky situation with the government? And I think in that perspective, we decided to shut down because we didn't feel like we had a good path forward for profitability. While Clean Team, on the other hand, we saw that we were able to make margin at a certain volume. And we sort of knew what that break-even number was, and we knew the core tenets of where we could improve costs, right? So some of our, like the actual raw material of what goes into the toilet to keep the smell down, we knew that was a huge driver of profitability. So we had a better idea, and we also knew that customer churn was an issue. So we were really improving the sales model. So that, because the core business had a much clearer path and we understood the sensitivities in the financial model, I think it was a little bit easier to stay there. Plus, we were able, I think later on after I left, we were able to bring on a turnaround CEO who really invested and built up the local team. And I think that's a large part of the reason why it was a success, and it's still around today.
So, going back to, I guess, Smart Life, like, I remember, hindsight 2020, but was part of it kind of incentive structure as well, in terms of, let's say if this was actually a company being run by two founders, or a couple of founders trying to build this as a business on their own, versus, let's say, employees being kind of tasked, treating this as a project, right? Would that have helped, or was it other things like the distribution cost, the high cost of filtration, the fact that you couldn't find these ancillary products to sell, et cetera?
I think there's probably, I mean, there actually is truth. There actually is a social enterprise by the name of Jibu that scaled in Uganda and has actually done quite well with a really similar model. So there is a component of when it's an entrepreneur who's really scrappy versus an employee who's like sort of grant funded, like the need to like ideate and find a solution. And that pressure is really there to be able to create a solution. I think there is the agility definitely was there. I would say, I would agree that having Smart Life have to report to two entities, right? WSUP and Unilever, probably made it harder, right? Like, we were forcing some of the questions and didn't give them the runway. There was incentive that needed to make sense for each organization to continue supporting, right? So we probably put additional burden onto the business and didn't give it the remit to be able to ideate to what made sense for them. So to your point, I think there is a component of having a scrappy entrepreneur really does help, because we've seen a business within East Africa scale with a similar model, and they were actually able to do it because they decided to not hire employees to run each of the kiosks, but they actually have it as a micro franchise model. So then again, right, like the entrepreneur themselves have incentive, and then they are then engaging with entrepreneurs who are like figuring out how to make each location work. And because it's their baby, it's their incentive to be able to make profit. I think they probably put more effort and more creativity into
it. In what ways, and maybe this is then taking a step back, right? In what ways can having an NGO as a stakeholder, as a funder of a social business help them, and what ways are they harmed by that? And you alluded to a few things like reporting, et cetera, and incentives.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the environments that we're working in, especially with water and sanitation, because of the infrastructure that's required, it takes a long time to break even, and it's a large capital cost. So grant funding is really appealing, right? You see a lot of social enterprises fall into this trap. Grant funding seems like it's quote unquote free money, because you don't have to pay it back or there's no equity involved. However, I think a lot of social enterprises underestimate estimate the amount of effort it takes to report. And because usually with grants, they tell you what you have to use the money for, and you have to report back upon that. And it's usually quite strict in comparison to other startup capital options that you can have. So it looks like it's free because you don't have to pay it back, but people forget that the amount of time that the organization spends reporting back takes up a lot of time as well. But I would say in some ways it helps with large infrastructure, large capital projects like a water and sanitation business. But I think it has to be done quite thoughtfully, and you have to know what you're getting yourself into. Because the other thing is infrastructure with businesses like infrastructure ones, like you realize there is no value chain for you to tap into. You end up feeling the need to create the whole value chain, which takes a lot of time and a lot of capital to do. So I think you just have to really understand your market, understand what's available in the market you're in terms of players and value chain, and then be realistic with how long it'll take you to be able to get to break even and build that.
Got it. And so then I think this is also maybe a philosophical question. Like, what is the ideal kind of role of NGOs in trying to create businesses? Is it having a direct hand? Is it being a funder? Is it going to more of a venture capital model? And you must have seen models now beyond WSUP. What makes sense to you, at least based on your experience?
I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think it's I think this is what ultimately how I ended up at Rippleworks, but being really venture friendly or company friendly and understanding their needs is really important. So if an NGO can do that, I think that works. I think I think the timelines for some of these businesses to really be able to stand up on their own 2 feet is like much longer, right? I think originally when we got into the field in 2013, we thought, oh, like 1 to 3 years you would be profitable. And I think it's really coming out to be like more like 5 to 7 years probably. And so for some businesses, or even 7 to 10 years, is because of the amount that needs to be built to get there. So I think we as an industry now understand it takes a lot longer than we used to think. But that role is just being agile, realizing that with a business, you have to pivot. Like, I don't think there's any business who I've heard who has not had to pivot what they've been doing. And so providing that agility and the flexibility is really important. And so if an NGO can do that, I think it's fine. But because it is in conflict with who they are or how they've received the money, I think you have to recognize that you're going to be a hindrance on that company. So a lot of times, I think there's now different models where like governments like UK aid recognize that they can't do it well. So they're like partnering with someone else who can do it on their behalf, because it gives them a little bit of remit to be able to step away and not place like the frameworks and the reporting that's required on these businesses. Yeah, like I don't. You've probably heard about this, but Unilever's partnered with UK aid in their Transform project. It's basically similar. Like they're partnering with Unilever, and Unilever is more of like the VC for them because they recognize that they weren't doing it well.
One last point on WSUP, right? And I know we tried a version of Clean Team once again in Bangladesh. What were some? I mean, and I know you unfortunately you weren't able to get to Bangladesh during your time, but just watching it from afar, what are some reflections on the market when it comes to, I guess, low income sanitation in Bangladesh compared to, say, Ghana or some of the other countries you worked in?
I think social norms are really important, right? I mean, I think we ran into this whole question of, does most of the population sit or squat? Like, what's normal? And I remember like trying to take the toilet from Ghana to Bangladesh, and it just wasn't a cultural norm. Like they would sit there and like look at it and be like, what is this for? And so if you're used to squatting and then suddenly you're asked to sit, it feels really quite strange. And then also the way that the community uses the toilet, right? So like in Ghana, they really liked having a family toilet, while in Bangladesh, I believe, if I recall, it was more a group of families, right, who sort of knew each other, shared a toilet. So like your perception of the toilet is a little bit different. While in Ghana, like you would share with strangers. So like if you could get away from a public toilet, it was really appeal. So I think like one, the technology needed to be vetted. So I think that was one of the big questions, like do you sit, do you squat? And then the business model of who is your customer? Is your customer a group of families, and how do you navigate a subscription model with that versus like an individual family, and you knew who you could speak to directly about it?
Excellent. So I'll just kind of, and thank you for that. I'll just kind of go now to Rippleworks before we go to Q&A. Yeah, would you be able to explain what is Rippleworks and what's the general, how does it work as an organization?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I should step back is Rippleworks was founded only about 6 years ago. And it was founded by Silicon Valley CEOs who wanted to give back. So one of the things I respect is they started off with user interviews, understanding what gap was there in the market. What they found was at the beginning of any company's life or any nonprofit's life, there's a lot of resources, whether it be grant money, seed money. But then as you grow, those options sort of disappear, but then you're suddenly too small for some of the bigger investors, and like that were giving a couple of $1 million, right? And so we've always found this. It's called the missing middle, or ventures can't get through this gap. And so our two founders had recognized that the problems are different, but someone solved it in the world typically. Usually it's not a business model question, it's just building a business question. So it's like, how does my sales team work? How do I build a people organization? How do I hire people quickly now that I need to hire more than one person at a time, right? So they had recognized this is knowledge that's around the world. And so they wanted to fill that gap, and they recognized the faster we could help catalyze the growth of these organizations, the faster we were going to help scale their impact. So Rippleworks is really founded on helping to provide skills and expertise to organizations when they need it to help catalyze their growth. So we do that in one of three ways. We either do it with an in-depth project where we really design a project that's tailored to the organization. We identify a functional area that's really at need, that's critical for the next 18 to 24 months. And we go and find an expert to help them ideate the solution for that. And we say, like, one of our goals is not just the answer at the end of it of how to solve your problem, but two, we really want the organization to have the skills to be able to do it on their own in the future. So it's really around talent. It's really around capabilities building so that it's going to be inside the venture rather than having to go outside to go find it. And then the other thing that we do is we support some professional development of leaders. Small companies, small nonprofits typically don't have budget for professional development, but leadership skills are some of the most important things as you scale. Of how do you become a leader? How do you manage people effectively and motivate them? How do you build a culture where people are feeling valued and empowered to continue doing the work? So that's what Rippleworks is really about. It's about skills building, capabilities building, and really supporting ventures who are scaling and growing to be able to continue on their journey to be able to create more impact.
I noticed I guess one of the requirements of a company or a project that you look for is that you have quote unquote credible co-investors. Who are they typically?
I think the credible investors is we have a network of investors who we work with. They're typically impact investors, philanthropic foundations who have a similar theory of change and ethos to us. So some of the people we partner with are we've talked to Acumen, we work with the Siegel Foundation, Malago. There's a lot of impact investors who we keep in touch with on a regular basis as well. So that's how we typically get our referrals. But in our effort to be more equitable, we're really trying to explore how do we make ourselves more open to be able to meet ventures who may not be coming through those paths as well.
And the other, so you do fund these enterprises or nonprofits, and I think there's kind of three models, right? Mostly grants, but then there's also debt and equity. So when do you decide between one or the other?
Yeah, so we fund some. We don't fund all of the ventures who we work with, but same thing as all of the whole ethos that we try to live by is we want to be a catalyst somehow to help ventures grow. So our investments thesis is also the same. Is we are really upfront. We are a one-time investor. We want to help organizations prove out a model or prove out a theory that other investors are. We often found that organizations would go to funders and say, hey, we want you to fund this. And the funder would say, hey, it sounds like a really interesting idea, but you haven't proved it out. So you end up with a chicken and egg problem. You have an idea, but you don't have the data to be able to fund it, but you can't fund it because you don't have the data, which is sort of ironic. So what we do is, if we really believe in your vision and, we find that it's an idea that we want to try to test with you, we'll be a one-time funder to go in. We will give nonprofits a grant, and we will give for-profits a loan. And the whole idea is our goal at the end of that is once you're able to get that data and prove out your thesis, you're able to crowd in more capital, whether it be from impact investors or more traditional development funders.
So you talk about the crowd-in effect, the catalytic capital. You talk about measurement of data. How do you sort of see the ROI when you invest in these ventures?
It's the amount of money they can raise once they've proven out the thesis, right? And it's pretty clear. And I can go ask my investments team, but I can't remember what time horizon we look at, but it's pretty clear that once you get the data, if you can go convince other people to invest in you, like that's sort of our success rate. And then the amount of capital is what we keep track of how much they're crowding in.
Absolutely. And then, I know you work quite a bit on the talent pipeline development and also things like sales ops and execution. On the sales ops side, for these sort of companies, I think for the most part, they're catering to the bottom of the pyramid, maybe very similar to the profile of customers like Clean Team and Smart Life are going after. And you've also worked with these very large multinational companies, right? And the FMCG space. Maybe this is a very generic question, but how is it different, I guess, when it comes to, creating sales for teams that are catering to that market versus maybe a little bit more richer, a little bit more wealthier consumer segments?
I think in both of them, you're trying to figure out how do you generate, right? It's the funnel question. How do you generate good leads at the top of the funnel? Because I think when you're a smaller organization, you tend to think the number of leads is what's important, but actually the quality of leads is actually more important, right? So how do you get from the top of the funnel, people into the funnel? How do you quickly assess who is likely going to be able to convert into a customer quickly and commit your resources to them? Because if there's a lot of noise and you're working with a lot of potential customers who don't convert, it eats up a lot of your costs, right? So sales productivity numbers are really important of how quickly are you getting through it in terms of velocity, and then what are your conversion rates going from the top all the way through. So we work with a lot of organizations to help sales teams assess that of identifying a lead, qualifying a lead, and nurturing the lead until close, and putting together the metrics to be able to measure that so that management can know where the potential problems are and where they need to go and address the issues.
The other question on talent, I also, I know we worked with, for example, MBA Without Borders back at WSUP, and it's benefited from them quite a bit. But there's still that model of we're going to drop in these experts, and then they'll do a sprint on a certain project, and then the execution would be left up to the locals. And I would imagine you're trying to then get to that point of, okay, how do we build local capacity? What are some things that have helped, or what are some things that you do to actually help build that?
Well, so I think I would say two things. When we're looking at any experts who are engaging for a short time, which I typically consider 6 months or less, which is MBAs Without Borders as well as our experts, you have to remember there's time required at the beginning to set context, right? Like they might have the complete knowledge to come and help you, but they need to understand the context. So in both of those situations, whether it be our experts in our projects or the MBAs Without Borders, it typically took about 2 to 4 weeks for someone to really get their brain around what is your business model and what are the intricacies. So don't forget that, I guess, is one thing I would say. And then two, then it's ideating and creating, right? So it's really easy for an expert to lend their advice and their ideas, but I think you need to be explicit with them that you want to not just get to the answer, but help the teams understand how you got there, because it's all the things that they are doing so quickly in their heads without even writing it down that you want to be able to convert to your teams. So that takes longer. However, it's much more valuable because you're seeing the process happen rather than just seeing the answer. So that's one of the things that I think I learned both in our experience working with MBAs Without Borders as well as at Rippleworks is really explicitly asking the person who has that knowledge to slow it down and to be able to explain it step by step, and then give the ability of the person who's learning the opportunity to ask questions so they can fully understand why it's happening, like why things are happening the way they are.
And so, yeah, I guess the idea of kind of playbooks and standardizing that knowledge as these sorts of institutionalized makes a ton of sense. The last question I have on Rippleworks, at least from my side, is I know we looked at projects together in Bangladesh at a very high level. When do you think a country like Bangladesh is ready for, I guess, interventions like Rippleworks or these types of, I guess, novel impact investors?
I think we spoke a couple of weeks ago, Nijar, that I was really impressed at how fast Bangladesh has changed in the past, 7 or 8 years that you've been there. I think when you first arrived, it was very clear that the NGO sector was skewing the market, right? They were just flooding money in so that the private sector couldn't really develop. But I think that's really changed. And so I don't think there's a right or wrong time for investors like Rippleworks and other peers to go in. I think right now, I think it's just a little bit of access. I know that for Rippleworks, we are consciously also trying to build our networks outside of sub-Saharan Africa, where ours are strongest. But in some ways, because Bangladesh has some philanthropy in country, it's sort of skewed because people just don't have access to, they don't know them, right? They don't know the people. But I don't think there's a right or wrong time. I think Bangladesh is probably ready. I think funders need to stop subsidizing, which will make like profitable models more appealing. But at the time when you first started, there was so much subsidization happening that I don't think a for-profit company, it wouldn't make sense for them to come in at that time. But I think it's changed a lot now.
In many of these segments, right, including water and sanitation, for sure. I'll just have this one kind of final question. We do have in the room, young, professionals, including female professionals who aspire to where you are. I guess, if you were to kind of think about giving advice to someone who wants to be kind of where you are in the future, what's worked for you and what would you do differently?
I think you just got to try it, right? You've got to try doing it. I think first, impact is a very large sector. There are many different facets of it. So take the time and do informational interviews. I think we feel bad or we feel timid to ask someone, but most people love talking about themselves, right? Sharing. And I don't think you can replicate their path, but at least you can understand why they liked something or why they didn't and whether things resonate with you. So find out what you really are passionate about and what you think you might want to try. And I think then if you're really interested, there's a couple of options. If you have, for me, I had the opportunity that my life situation dictated that I could move to Kenya to try it. So I did, but there's volunteer efforts that you could do. You could do things on the side. You could be an advisor and you could start trying out whether you like it. And then I think there's a little bit of luck and timing involved in all of life, right? I have one of the quotes a friend told me once is, you just have to be prepared to take the opportunities that come in front of you, right? You can't make them all happen, but you, one, have to recognize them, and then two, be willing to step into them. So I think that's the other thing is being open, telling people what you're interested in, and then when the opportunity arises, to take the opportunity, if you feel like it's right for you. There is no right path. If you look at my career, it meanders back and forth between social impact as well as private sector. But most of it has just been by a little bit of luck, talking to some friends and telling them what I was interested in doing, and them being my champion as well, because they knew what I was capable of doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nitida.
I think I use my skills all the time. So part of my job is to work with CEOs and founders to just understand what their challenges are in the next 18 to 24 months. And really at that point in the process, I'm really a thought partner to them, right? Asking them questions of, what skill sets do they think that they don't have that they want to build in their organization? What questions do they have that are unanswered? So I find myself using one, as as an engineer, like how to ask questions and sort of how to have a hypothesis when you're like asking those questions to figure out what the root cause might be. And then two, just throughout my life, I've sort of had different business experiences. And so I've pulled on various versions of that, whether it be at the very beginning of my career or later on, to be able to talk to them about the subject matter, to be able to help them break down their big question into maybe a couple of smaller questions, and then figuring out where the biggest need might be. But yeah, I think the structured thinking that I learned both from my studies as well as my first couple of years, I think I use a lot. And I spent a lot of time in large organizations and really having to work through people. So taking the time to get to know people, understand their motivations is really key. I think the interpersonal skills is something that I learned early on in my career, and I think has really benefited me throughout. Rippleworks isn't a straight VC. I think a lot of the work that we do is, but I think with VC, it's interpersonal skills, right? How do you build rapport with entrepreneurs quickly? I think it's networking to find the opportunities, right? And understanding sort of what those skill sets are. Like it's networking, letting people know you're interested. And the more that they know you, the more they're going to be willing to like give you the benefit of the doubt as you make that transition. But with VCs, it's interpersonal skills, being able to judge quickly whether it's someone you might want to work with in your portfolio. And I think what also helps is experience in a startup, right? Entrepreneurs often feel more at ease with people who've sort of been in their shoes before. Just doing something entrepreneurial, it doesn't have to be that you started it, but something like being involved somehow will also help.